The desert was quiet, the kind of silence that stretched so wide it could weigh on a person's chest. A lonely widow stood in the hard light of the afternoon sun, her black dress heavy against the heat, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains rose like faded memories. Behind her, the white adobe walls of a small church glowed under the sky, its bells silent, its doors open as though waiting for prayers that would never come. She was tired of waiting. The land stretched all around her, dry and endless, and yet it felt smaller with each passing year. She had no children to fill the house, no husband to share the burdens, and only the echo of her own footsteps for company. The days had become shadows of each other, repeating themselves in silence. It was then that he came. An Apache warrior with long unbound hair, his chest bare and bronzed, his gaze calm but watchful. His presence was like the desert itself, fierce, steady, and unyielding. He stood before her, silent, his shadow long in the sun, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his knife, though he made no move toward it. She lowered her eyes, not in fear, but in something else, something harder to name. Respect, perhaps, or the sharp edge of need. The widow had been holding on to her land with both hands, even as the years stole from her strength. The ranch, with its broken fences and thirsty soil, had once been a dream. Now it was a burden too heavy for one woman alone. She had watched neighbors leave, selling off what they could, chasing new lives in towns where laughter still lived. But she stayed. The land was all she had, and she refused to let it go. And yet, in the quiet of the desert nights, she knew she was losing more than just her strength. She was losing time. The Apache knew this too. His people were being pushed further into the dry hills, their hunting grounds shrinking with each season, their way of life caught between survival and loss. He had walked into her life not as an enemy, not even as a stranger, but as part of the land itself, like the wind and the sand and the lonely howl of coyotes at dusk. And she, with the weight of years pressing on her shoulders, had spoken words that surprised even her own heart. "I will give you my land if you give me a child." The words hung heavy in the air, spoken plain, without tremble or shame. She had nothing left to trade but her land, and nothing left to hope for but a child. Not a husband, not love, not even companionship in the way the town women whispered about. Just a child. Someone to carry her blood, her name, her memory into a future she would never see. A small life to water the dry soil of her days. The Apache's dark eyes lingered on her, searching her face for lies, for weakness, for some trap laid by desperation. But all he saw was truth. A woman stripped bare of all but her need, and a need, proposition that bound her to him as tightly as the land itself. He did not answer right away. He looked past her, to the church, to the mountains, to the endless desert. He was a man of few words, a man whose silence carried more weight than speech. And in his silence, the widow felt her heart beat harder, as if daring her to regret what she had offered. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the sand. The air grew cooler, though the tension between them burned hotter. She did not step closer, nor did he. Yet something in the space between them changed, like the shifting of earth before a storm. The widow's hands trembled only once, then stilled as she forced herself to hold her chin high. She had made her choice. What mattered now was his, but the Apache remained unreadable, his face as still as stone, his chest rising and falling with the quiet rhythm of the desert. He could walk away. He could leave her standing there, her words trailing behind like dust in the wind. Or he could accept, and with his choice bind not only himself but his people to this small piece of earth. For him, the decision was more than personal. It was survival. For her, it was more than survival. It was the last chance at meaning. A hawk cut through the sky above them, its cry sharp and echoing across the land. The widow turned her gaze upward, her eyes following the bird until it vanished into the blazing horizon. When she looked back, the Apache had not moved. His eyes were on her still, steady, and dark, as though measuring her spirit against the weight of the world. The silence grew longer, until it felt as if the desert itself was listening. The widow's heart pounded with every passing second. Had she gone too far? Had her loneliness driven her into madness? The offer was bold, unthinkable, perhaps even dangerous. Yet she did not take it back. She could not. For in that moment, she knew that her life would not continue without change, and that the only way forward lay in the hands of the man before her. The Apache finally breathed in deep, the first sign that he was more than a shadow carved into the sun. He lowered his gaze for a moment, as though considering not just her, but the weight of all that came with her offer. Land, blood, legacy. Then, slowly, his eyes returned to hers, and in them was something she could not name. Not yet. The desert wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust. The widow's lips parted, waiting, her heart caught between dread and hope. The Apache's silence pressed down on her like the very sky, and yet she knew his answer would come not in haste, but in its own time. The kind of time only the desert could teach. Still, as the sun slipped lower and the first shadows of evening touched the earth, she could not help but wonder if she had just traded everything she owned for a future that might never come. And there, in the gathering dusk, the widow and the Apache stood locked in silence, the land itself holding its breath for what would follow next. The night came slowly, draping its heavy cloak across the desert. The widow stood in the doorway of her house, her black dress blending into the deepening shadows. The Apache had not yet given her an answer. He had left as silently as he came, walking into the desert as if swallowed by the earth itself. She watched until the last trace of him vanished into the horizon. The silence that followed was sharper than before, and for the first time, her bold words felt heavier than she could bear. She leaned against the doorway, her hand resting against the wood, and let the night breeze wash over her face. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried out, and she closed her eyes. The land around her had once been full of promise. She and her husband had come here years ago, filled with hope, believing the soil could be tamed and turned into something fruitful. He had been strong, full of laughter, a man who believed that hard work could bend the world into his will. She had believed it too. They built the house with their own hands, carved fences into the earth, and brought cattle to graze the dry fields. For a while it had worked. For a while the ranch had been alive with the sound of hooves, the smoke of cooking fires, and the warmth of shared labor. But dreams in the desert are fragile. A fever had taken her husband, swift and merciless, leaving her with nothing but the house, the fences, and the dry land. She had buried him under the mesquite tree near the church, and since that day, the land had seemed to grow heavier. The cattle were sold off one by one, the neighbors stopped visiting, and the silence crept in, filling the corners of her house. Until it became the only sound she knew. She had thought she could endure it, that she could hold on to the land in his memory. But years had a way of carving their truth into a person, and her truth was loneliness, the kind that hollowed a woman out, leaving her a shadow of who she had once been. When she looked at the walls of the house, she saw only emptiness. When she lay in her bed at night, she felt the crushing weight of a future without a family, without a child to carry on what little remained of her world. It was in that emptiness that the Apache appeared. She had seen him before, from a distance, moving across the land like a spirit that belonged to it more than she ever could. He never came close, never lingered near her house, but she knew he was there. She had heard whispers in town of Apache, raids, of stolen cattle, of dangers that crept in the night. But when she saw him, he did not look like danger. He looked like the desert itself, untamed and watchful, his silence filled with something deeper than words. The first time she spoke to him had been by chance. She had gone to the well near the church, and he had been there, standing as if waiting for the earth to give him water. Their eyes had met, and neither of them had spoken. Yet in that moment, something passed between them, something neither could name. She returned home shaken, not with fear but with a strange awareness that she was no longer alone in her silence. From that day on, she knew he would return. When he finally stood before her, listening to the boldness of her offer, she felt the years of her silence shatter. The words had spilled from her lips before she had time to stop them. It was madness. Perhaps, but it was a madness born from truth. And now, with the night pressing in, she wondered what it would mean if he accepted. What kind of child would come from such an exchange? Would the child belong to her, or to him, or to both? Would the land truly hold the weight of such a promise? The widow lay in her bed that night, staring at the wooden beams above her, her mind restless. She thought of the land stretching endlessly, waiting to be claimed or abandoned. She thought of the Apache's eyes, steady and searching, filled with a silence she could not penetrate. And she thought of the child she longed for, a life that could change everything. The night seemed endless, filled with questions without answers. Far away, in the desert, the Apache sat by a fire. His people were restless, caught between hunger and survival, watching their world vanish piece by piece. The widow's words echoed in his mind, stirring something he did not want to name. To take her offer meant binding himself to her world, to the land she guarded with her grief. It meant stepping into a future that might divide him from his own people. And yet, it also meant the promise of something enduring, something that could not be stolen by soldiers or swallowed by hunger. A child. A bridge between two worlds that had only ever known conflict. He stared into the flames, his jaw tight, his mind heavy with the weight of her proposition. His people needed land, safety, a place where they could endure. But he knew that her land was not just soil. It was her memory, her pain, her last tether to a life that had crumbled. To take it was to take her heart, and he was not yet certain. If he could carry that weight. Days passed, and the widow tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. She mended fences, swept the church floor, tended the small patch of garden that still clung to life near her house. But every sound made her turn her head, every shadow made her wonder if he had returned. The waiting gnawed at her, sharp as hunger. She told herself she could endure it, but each night she lay awake, her thoughts circling like vultures over the same question. Had she given away too much? Or had she finally spoken the one truth that could save her? The town whispered about her, though she did not care. They said she was mad for living alone on the edge of the desert. That grief had hollowed her out. Some pitied her, others scorned her, but none of them came close enough to know her truth. She carried their whispers like dust on the wind, letting it settle without protest. They did not know what it was to stand in silence day after day, year after year, with nothing but the echo of one's own footsteps. The Apache did not return at once, but his presence lingered as if the desert itself had marked her. At night, she thought she saw him in the distance, a shadow moving across the hills, a figure standing by the mesquite tree where her husband lay. She could not be certain if it was him or her own longing conjuring ghosts. Yet the thought of him filled her with both fear and hope, a strange mix that tightened her chest each time she stepped outside. The land itself seemed to wait, as though it too held its breath. The fences creaked, the wind carried dust across the fields, the church bell hung silent in its tower. Every corner of her world felt suspended, caught between the past she could no longer endure and the future that had not yet arrived. And then, one evening, As the sun bled red across the horizon, she saw him again. He stood at the edge of her land, still and silent, his figure outlined against the fading light. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands tightening against her dress. He had come back. But he did not move forward, nor did he call out. He simply stood there, watching, as if testing the ground between them. The widow's heart pounded. She wanted to speak, to call out to him, but the words tangled in her throat. She stepped forward instead, each movement heavy with the weight of what she had already offered. The air between them felt charged, alive, as though the land itself was listening once again. He did not step closer, but his presence was enough to make her knees weak. The moment stretched, long and unbroken, until the sun dipped fully behind the mountains and the desert was swallowed in twilight. She stopped walking, standing only a few paces closer than before. Her eyes searched his face, looking for an answer, for a sign, for anything that might break the silence, but the Apache said nothing. He only watched her, his dark eyes steady, his figure carved in shadow. And once again, she was left to wonder if her future lay in his silence, or if the desert would take her words and bury them forever. He came again at dawn. The first light touched the adobe church and ran out across the dry grass. And there he was, standing by the mesquite tree that watched over the grave. The widow was already outside with a bucket, listening to the rope groan as the well's old windlass turned. When she saw him, she let the bucket rest on the stone lip and waited. Her hands were dry and cracked. His face, calm as ever, gave nothing away. "I will not take your land," he said at last, "not as a trade." His voice was low, careful, "but I will not walk away." The widow felt the ground shift, as if the desert had turned to water beneath her feet. The words were not a yes, not a no, and yet they made a new road appear between them. She nodded once, because she had no other answer for something so heavy. He looked past her to the house, to the fences leaning like old men, to the cattle path turned to dust. "Soldiers rode south yesterday," he said. 3 wagons a flag. A gun on wheels. They spoke to ranchers. They asked about raids. The widow swallowed. "There have been no raids here." "They will come again," he said. "They do not ask. They take." She felt the old fear stir, the kind that lived under the ribs and never left. She knew the soldiers were not the only threat. The land itself was a kind of enemy when the sky forgot to rain. She filled the bucket and carried it to the house. When she looked back, the Apache still stood by the mesquite tree, watching the church door, the grave, the house, as though the three were one. Word traveled along the dusty road to town that soldiers were pushing for order, that papers would be required, that any land with unclear claims might be seized for the new rail spur. A stranger had arrived with measuring chains and a brass compass, calling himself a surveyor for the railroad company. He wore a neat hat and had a way of speaking that carried a promise and a threat in the same breath. He asked polite questions about wells and deeds. He smiled in a thin way that did not reach his eyes. The sheriff kept to the shade near the mercantile and watched the surveyor set stakes along the dry creek. He was a patient man, careful with his words, but his hand stayed near his belt the entire afternoon. The preacher came out to speak with him, a tall, hollow-cheeked figure whose black coat rode the wind like a flag. "The widow has a deed," the preacher said. "Signed and stamped proper." The sheriff nodded. "Paper is paper. The railroad has a lot of paper." The preacher stared toward the church at the far edge of sight. "She has kept that place, standing by her own hand. Folks should let it be." "They never do," the sheriff said. He spit into the dust and tipped his hat lower. The widow came to town once a week for flour and salt, and when she rode in that morning the street grew quiet. She felt the silence settle like a shawl across her shoulders. She saw the surveyor. glance up from his compass with sharp interest. The sheriff raised 2 fingers in greeting. The preacher stepped into her path so she would have to stop. "You have someone watching your place," he said in a soft voice. She held his gaze. "The desert is full of eyes." "You know who I mean." "I do," she said. The preacher looked as if he wanted to say more, then thought better of it. He stepped aside and let her pass. By noon, wind came up from the south and turned the town into a bowl of dust. The widow bought what she needed and headed home. Halfway along the road, she saw tracks that were not hers or her horse's. Barefoot, long striding, headed toward her land. She felt no fear, only a tightening inside that felt like the last twist on a rope. She followed them with her eyes until they slipped off the road into the thorn and sand. The Apache was waiting at her gate. His hair was tied with a thin strip of leather. A hawk feather rested behind his ear. "Men measured your land," he said without preamble. "They spoke to your neighbors." "What did the neighbors say?" "They said your well is deep, and said your field has a hard bottom but will open when the rains turn." He looked at the sky, a wide plain of blue without mercy. "They hope for rain." "So do I," she said. "So does every living thing." He studied her a moment more. "My people move camp tonight," he said. "The soldiers press them from the hills. They will pass near here. I will ask them not to cross your fields." "You can ask," she said, the corners of her mouth lifting in the smallest way. "But will they listen?" He did not smile. "They will listen to me if I can show that." "You are not the enemy. And how would you show that?" He glanced at the mesquite tree, then at the church door, then back to her. "I will speak with your dead, a man who is planted there. I will tell him that I will not break what he made." The widow's breath left her chest. She had not heard anyone speak of her husband like that in years. She felt a sting behind her eyes and had to look away. "There is no need," she said after a long moment. "He knows the truth." That night, campfires pricked the hills like small stars. From the porch, the widow watched shadows move across the ridge. The wind carried a faint song that rose and fell in a pattern older than the church bell. It was not a war song. It sounded like a prayer, a promise, or both. Near midnight, hoofbeats came up the road. The sheriff, the surveyor, and 2 soldiers rode in slow, their faces pale in the moonlight. The sheriff removed his hat. "Evening," he said. The widow stood straight at the edge of the porch, one hand on the post. "Evening." The surveyor spoke first. "We've been marking new lines," he said in that thin voice. "The company offers fair money for tracks near the creek. It would bring growth. The church might get new boards, the town a new well." "It's not for sale," she said. The soldier with the narrow face nudged his horse forward. "There's trouble with bands moving through. You might be safer closer to town." "I have stayed safe by staying put," she said. "And I will keep staying." The sheriff cut in before the soldier could push. "We wanted to see if you'd heard anything," he said. "Strange tracks. Any news?" She considered the 3 men. "I hear coyotes," she said. "I hear the wind. I hear the bones of the house shift when it cools." She held the surveyor's gaze. "What I do not hear is the sound of my land shaking hands with the company." The surveyor's smile tightened. "Times change. Water still runs downhill," she said, "and promises still run where the money points." A flicker of respect moved in the sheriff's eyes. He tugged his reins and turned his horse. "We'll be by again," he said. "Be careful." After they rode away, the widow stood on the porch until her legs ached. The campfires on the ridge burned lower. The song faded. She went inside and sat at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of water that had long gone warm. She thought of the offer she had made, of the new road that had opened between her and the Apache. of the railroad line creeping toward the dry creek, of the soldiers sniffing the wind like wolves. Sleep would not come. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, listening for the sound of a footstep that might break the silence one way or the other. Across the ridge, the Apache met with his elder. The old man's hair was white at the temples, but his eyes burned steady. "You bring us near the church," the elder said. "Mere graves. This is not our way." The younger man kept his gaze on the coals. "The woman's land has water. Deep. The soldiers look for a reason to push us east. We have little powder, little meat. We must pass where the ground is kinder." "Your eyes have been on that house," the elder said. "My eyes have been on survival. There is a difference." The elder replied. He picked up a coal with a stick and drew a circle in the dirt. "A circle is land. A circle is family. Break one and the other learns the habit." The younger man said nothing. He thought of the widow standing with dust on her dress, of the steady way she faced the sheriff, of the grave under the mesquite tree and the quiet strength in her voice when she said her dead knew the truth. He thought of the child she wanted and the land she would trade, and how both ideas cut across his spirit like a sharp edge. He did not want to admit, even to himself, that the edge both wounded and pulled him forward. At dawn, the camp moved on, southwest across the dry flats. The Apache broke away and came down to the widow's fence. She was already in the yard, sleeves rolled high, washing the porch as if a clean floor could fight back the army of dust. He told her the camp would skirt the far hills. She thanked him and offered a tin cup of water. He drank and handed it back, his hand brushing hers in that small space where strangers become something else. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then he said, "The surveyor will bring more men, I know. They will not come for conversation. I know that too. Will you leave if they force you?" Her jaw set. "I offered a trade. Because I want a future," she said. "I did not offer it because I have no fight left in me." He nodded as if he had expected no other answer. His gaze shifted to the well. How deep? 45 feet to the shelf. Another 10 to reach the good water when summer is hard. He considered, "Cover it when you sleep. They will poison before they dig." The widow felt a chill prick her arms despite the rising heat. She tied the well cover that night with new rope and set a bell on the lid so it would sing out if a hand lifted it, the next day sharpened like a knife. The surveyor returned with men carrying stakes. A wagon piled with lumber creaked behind them. They pressed beyond the creek and onto the open flats as if they already owned the view. A rancher whose fence kissed the widow's North Line rode over and warned her that deeds were being questioned if they lacked certain seals. He had one of the new stamps himself and said he got it by signing his name under a paper thick with words. "They call it progress," he said, eyes tired. "It pays a few debts." The widow thanked him and said nothing else. When he left, she took her old deed out of the wooden box where she kept it wrapped in cloth. The paper was yellowed but clear. Her husband's name stood firm, along with the mark of a county clerk who had died long ago. She pressed the sheet flat on the table and studied the letters as if they could turn into a wall around her land. That afternoon, a small figure came creeping to the fence from the road. A boy no more than 10, with a patched shirt and a hat too big for his head. He carried a note folded tight. "From the preacher's wife," he said. "She said to give it to you and run on home." The widow unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat and careful. Soldiers planned to search houses for signs of harboring. The word was underlined twice. Harboring who, the note did not say. Widow lifted her eyes to the ridge. She could not see anyone there, only the line of rock against a hot sky. She folded the note and slid it into her pocket. "Thank you," she told the boy. "Tell her I will visit the church tomorrow and sweep the floor." The boy tipped his hat and raced off, dust rising behind him. That night, something moved near the well. The bell trembled once, a soft ring like the start of a storm. The widow sat up in bed and reached for the lamp. Before she could light it, a hand touched the window frame from outside, slow and deliberate. She held her breath and listened. The sound came again, a careful scrape. She rose and went to the door, lifting the bar as quietly as she could. Her eyes had already learned the shapes of the yard by moonlight. A man crouched by the well, shadow within shadow. The bell vibrated once more and whispered against the lid. She stepped forward. "Leave it," she said, her voice calm and cold. Man froze. He wore a soldier's coat without the brass and a cloth over his mouth. She could see the set of his shoulders, not the Apache. Not a neighbor, not the sheriff. The man rose, slow as smoke. He slipped back one step, then another. When he reached the fence, he paused. Her hand tightened on the lantern, not yet lit. The man lifted his fingers to the cloth and pressed them there as if to seal his face. Then he vanished into the dark dot. At dawn, she found a small packet on the ground by the fence post. Inside was a pinch of something gray that smelled sour and sharp. Lie, she guessed. Enough to foul the well for days. She buried it near the mesquite tree and set another stone on the grave, as if weight could guard memory and water both. The Apache arrived near sundown. She showed him the place where the packet had lain. He knelt and sniffed the dust. "Soldier," he said. "Boots, not moccasin. He will come again if he thinks you sleep." "I do not sleep," she said. The attempt at humor fell flat. He stood and looked toward the church. "There is a way to make them hesitate," he said. "I am listening. Invite them," he said. "Ask the sheriff to hold a prayer at the church for the safety of the well. Make it public. Force their hands to look clean." The widow stared at him. It was a simple plan and a hard one. It would pull her into town talk and make the soldiers stand in her doorway by invitation, not invasion. Yet it would also turn the well into more than a hole in the ground. It would make it a kind of promise the town would have to see and remember. "I will ask," she said. "But I do not trust that paper or prayers stop thirsty men." "They may not," he said. "But they slow them when many eyes are watching." She sent a boy at first light to the sheriff with a message. Before noon, word spread that there would be a gathering at the church at sundown. The sheriff came early, jaw tight. The preacher arrived with his coat flapping. The surveyor stood a little distance off, pretending he had business with his stakes. While he listened, 2 soldiers came, their faces smooth with official calm. Neighbors trickled in to fill the doorway. No one sat. The room carried the sound of breathing and boots and a cautious hope that something as soft as prayer could steady the ground. The preacher spoke in a plain voice about water and mercy and the need to leave a neighbor's well untouched. He said the land must be worked and the church must keep its door open for every soul that passed the ridge. He did not point at the soldiers when he spoke of mercy, and he did not look at the Apache when he spoke of souls, though the warrior stood just outside the light, a shadow near the door. When the prayer ended, the sheriff crossed himself in a tired way and turned to the soldiers. "You have what you came for," he said. "Witness enough." One soldier tipped his hat, unreadable. The other ran his tongue along his teeth and smiled at the widow. "It is a good well," he said, "a precious thing. Then perhaps—" "You will leave it in peace," she replied. "We leave many things in peace," the soldier said. "Other men do not." He glanced at the surveyor, that the surveyor's thin smile stayed. "Progress brings order," he said. The widow felt the room press close around her. She looked to the door where the Apache stood in the dusk. His eyes were on her, steady and waiting, as if asking whether she would still walk the road she had drawn with her own words. She held that gaze a long beat, then turned to the sheriff. "Will you ride the fence tonight?" she asked. "Not to keep folks out, to keep witnesses in. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded once. "I will ride," he said. The gathering broke apart and spilled into the yard. The sky bled into the kind of evening that sets nerves tight. The soldiers rode away without hurry. The surveyor lingered, then followed. The preacher's wife pressed the widow's hands and said she would bring bread in the morning. The sheriff mounted and set off along the north fence, his silhouette sliding along the edge of the world. When the yard was empty, the Apache stepped into the last of the light. He did not speak. He looked at the grave, then the well, then the church, then back to the widow. She felt the pull of every direction at once and understood that each choice would cost something she could not yet name. A wind rose from the east and brought with it a smell of smoke, faint and wrong. The widow and the Apache turned the same way at the same time. Along the far flats, a line of black began to unroll against the pale grass. Not a wildfire. A burn set with purpose. It moved slow at first, then quicker, sifting ash into the wind. The sheriff was a small mark racing the line. The soldier's wagon had stopped far out, motionless in the heat. The survey stakes stood like foolish teeth in the ground. The flames leaned toward the creek and the church. The widow felt her throat close. She looked to the Apache and saw his hand tighten against the knife at his belt, not for fighting men, but for cutting a firebreak hard and fast across a land no one could truly claim. They ran for the tools without a word, while the sky pulled darker and the wind pressed the fire toward everything they both were trying to hold. The fire rolled like a slow beast across the flats, its belly of smoke swelling against the evening sky. The widow and the Apache ran to the shed, their hands fumbling for shovels, for buckets, for anything that could carve a line in the dirt. The air was already sharp with ash, and the taste of it settled on the back of the widow's tongue. She wrapped a cloth around her mouth and pulled water from the well to soak a rag for her hair. The Apache poured sand over the edge of the fence, showing her how to stack the dirt against the board so they would not catch. He spoke few words, but each one carried weight. Dig deep. Wind will change. Fire hunts the weak line. The sheriff rode hard along the north fence, his horse lathered, his rifle swinging on its strap. He shouted something that was lost in the roar of the wind. Beyond him, the black smoke hid the soldier's wagon, but the orange of the fire showed through, brighter and stronger with every gust. The widow's heart pounded as she swung the shovel into the hard ground, breaking it open inch by inch. She thought of her husband, of the grave under the mesquite, of how he had built this place with his own hands, and she knew she would not see it burn without a fight. Neighbors appeared through the haze, drawn by the rising smoke. A rancher with a torn hat, the preacher with his coat tied at his waist, two boys carrying pails too heavy for their arms. They said nothing at first, just fell into the line, digging, hauling water, throwing sand. The preacher's voice rose above the noise in ragged bursts. Not a sermon, only words to steady frightened men. Hold the line. Keep your ground. The sheriff rode past them once more, shouting that the fire was bending east, that the wind might spare the creek. But the widow could see for herself that the sparks flew like angry bees toward the church roof, each one a threat to everything still standing. The Apache lifted his arm and pointed to the ridge. Figures moved there, shadows darting fast across the high ground. The widow squinted through the smoke. Not soldiers, not townsfolk, his people. They carried skins of water and heavy blankets, running sure-footed down the slope. For a moment, no one spoke, stunned by the sight of them coming to help. Then the preacher cried out, "All hands!" and the line opened to receive them. They dropped the water, smothered sparks, dragged branches to beat back the fire. It was not peace, not trust, but it was survival that bound them, and survival left no time for old hatred. The surveyor stood apart near the road, his face pale but his eyes calculating. He watched the fire with the look of a man reading a ledger. The widow caught his gaze once through the smoke and felt a chill colder than the ash against her skin. He raised his hat to her in a gesture that felt less like respect than a promise deferred. Then he turned and spoke to a soldier who had ridden back, the two of them whispering as if the flames were ink on a map they had drawn together. The fire reached the edge of the creek bed just as the wind shifted. The smoke pressed low, stealing the breath from every throat. Sparks rained down on the church roof. The widow dropped her shovel and climbed the porch, dragging a soaked blanket up the ladder. Her arm shook as she spread it wide across the boards, the fabric hissing with every ember that landed. The Apache steadied the ladder below her, his voice firm. "Hold it there. The roof will live." She clenched her teeth and pressed harder. Her knees burning from the heat rising through the boards. Below, the sheriff shouted orders, his voice hoarse. "Keep digging. Keep throwing dirt." The line staggered but held. Flames leapt at the edge of the firebreak, then curled back, searching for another way through. The widow saw the surveyor's figure blur in the smoke, then vanish. Her stomach clenched with the knowledge that men like him did not retreat. They only moved to places where plans ran deeper than roots. By midnight, the fire broke itself on the creek bed. The smoke thinned, leaving the land scorched but standing. The church walls were blackened, the roof damp but whole. The well steamed where hot ash had fallen, but the water below remained clean. Men dropped their shovels and collapsed to the ground. Women wiped soot from their faces. The preacher leaned against the doorframe of the church, his coat torn, his voice gone. The sheriff rode back slowly, his horse stumbling from exhaustion, his eyes shadowed with a knowledge he did not speak. The widow climbed down from the roof. Her dress burned at the hem, her hands blistered. She felt hollow, as if the fire had taken a part of her with it. She looked to the Apache, who stood with his people near the fence, his chest streaked with ash, his eyes still sharp. He gave no sign of victory, only a nod that said the fight was not over. She knew then that the fire had been only the first test, not the last. The next day brought no peace. Soldiers rode through town at dawn, demanding reports, taking notes, asking who had seen what. They said the fire had been set, though they offered no proof. They hinted that raiders had lit it, though no one had seen them near. The widow heard whispers that the railroad stood ready to seize land damaged by fire to protect it for future use. The preacher spoke out against it, his voice ragged but strong. Yet the sheriff only stared at the ground, caught between law and conscience. Widow kept to her porch, mending her roof, her eyes on the horizon. The Apache came at dusk, walking slow, his hands empty. He stood by the grave for a long time before speaking. "The fire was no accident," he said. The surveyor marked lines. "Fire follows lines. I saw him," she said, "talking with soldiers." "He will come again." "Yes," she said. "And so will you." He did not answer, but his silence was heavy with truth. The tension thickened in the days that followed. Soldiers camped near the road, their fires glowing at night like watchful eyes. The surveyor moved among them, his compass swinging, his stakes hammering into ground too close to her fence. Neighbors grew uneasy, torn between the promise of progress and the pull of loyalty. The sheriff rode the lines each evening, his jaw tight, his eyes never meeting hers for long. The preacher called for prayer every night, his voice echoing in the half-burned church. The widow felt the weight of her offer pressing harder than ever. She had asked for a child, for a future bound to the land, and now that promise hung like a shadow over everything. The Apache came often, bringing quiet warnings, watching her work the soil, watching her draw water from the well. They spoke little, but each word felt sharpened, cutting into the silence between them. He told her of soldiers moving camps, of whispers among his people that some wanted to strike back. She told him of the surveyor's thin smile, of the preacher's note about harboring, of the sheriff's silence that grew louder with every passing day. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. The cattle lowed nervously at night. Coyotes circled close, their cries sharp and hungry. The wind carried the smell of smoke again, faint but constant, as if another fire waited just beyond the horizon. The widow lay awake listening, her hand on the rope that barred the door, her ears straining for the sound of boots at the well. One night she heard it. The bell on the well rang once, clear and cold. She rose with her lantern and stepped to the door. Outside, shadows moved. Not one man, but several. She saw the glint of rifles in the moonlight, the shape of uniforms among them. The surveyor's voice carried low, almost soothing. Take the well. She cannot live without it. The widow's breath caught. She reached for her rifle, leaning by the door. Her hands shook, but her eyes were steady. The Apache was already there, a darker shadow at the edge of the yard, silent as stone. Their gazes met across the distance. No words passed, but the meaning was clear. The moment had come where every choice would carry a price. The soldiers moved closer, their boots crunching in the dust. The surveyor lifted his hand, a signal. The widow raised her rifle, her heart pounding like the war drum of the land itself. The Apache drew his knife, the blade flashing once in the moonlight. The air was thick with smoke and silence, stretched so thin it was ready to tear. Every soul on that land knew the breaking point was seconds away. The fire had been only the start. Now the true battle pressed at the door, and there was no turning back. The widow's finger trembled on the trigger as the soldiers crept closer to the well. The surveyor's hand lifted higher, and his sharp voice cut through the night. Take it, now. Boots scuffed against the dirt, rifle shifted, and the widow could hear the breath of men who thought the land already theirs. She steadied herself, her heart pounding with the weight of years spent fighting for this soil, for her husband's memory, for her promise to the future she had dared to imagine. The Apache stood across the yard, his knife gleaming in the lantern light. His presence gave her strength, as if the earth itself had joined her in saying no more. The first soldier stepped forward, but the widow's rifle cracked like thunder. The shot struck the dirt at his feet, throwing dust into the air. She had not aimed to kill, only to show her will. Silence fell, thick and heavy. The soldiers froze, their eyes wide. The Apache stepped forward into the light, his shadow stretching long across the yard. His voice was calm but unyielding. This land is not yours. Leave now. The sheriff appeared from the darkness then, his horse lathered from a hard ride. He raised his hand, his face drawn tight with conflict. Stand down, he called to the soldiers. This isn't your fight. The men hesitated, torn between the order and the surveyor's command. The surveyor's face twisted, pale and furious. You think you can stop progress with threats and old grudges? He spat. The railroad is coming. This woman is in the way. So is he. He pointed toward the Apache, his words cutting like a knife meant to divide. The sheriff dismounted slowly, placing himself between the soldiers and the widow. His voice dropped lower, almost weary. I've seen enough fire and ash. I won't see this land stolen under smoke and lies. For the first time, his loyalty was clear. The soldiers shifted uneasily, glancing at each other, waiting for someone else to choose. The surveyor cursed and tried to push them forward, but their boots did not move. The fire from nights before still clung to their memories, and the sight of neighbors standing ready at their porches made them doubt his orders. The Apache stepped closer, his knife lowered but steady. The land has its own law, he said. Break it, and you are broken. His words hung in the air, neither shouted nor whispered, but carried with the weight of the desert silence. The surveyor's mouth twisted into a sneer. He reached for the rifle slung over his shoulder, but the sheriff's revolver was quicker. A single shot rang out, striking the ground beside him. "Enough," the sheriff barked. "Leave now, while you still can." Defeated, the surveyor's fury burned in his eyes, but he knew the fight was lost. He turned on his heel, spitting into the dust, and stormed back toward the road. The soldiers followed slowly, heads low, their loyalty frayed and uncertain. The widow lowered her rifle, her arms heavy. The Apache stayed where he was, silent, his eyes locked on the horizon until the last figure vanished into the darkness. The yard grew still again. The widow let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The sheriff holstered his gun, his shoulders slumping. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "The surveyor will come back with papers instead of fire. He'll call it progress and some will believe him." The widow nodded. "Then we'll be ready," she said, her voice firm. She looked to the Apache, and though he spoke no words, the steady weight of his gaze told her she would not stand alone. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. Neighbors who had once whispered about her choices now came with hammers and nails, patching fences, mending roofs, hauling water to refresh the lands scorched by flame. The preacher brought his flock to the yard one evening, leading prayers not just for survival but for unity. The church, blackened by smoke, rang with voices that carried hope rather than fear. Children played in the dust, their laughter breaking. Through the heaviness that had hung over the town, the Apache's people returned as well, not in force but in quiet numbers, bringing bundles of herbs to heal burns, skins of water for the cattle, and hands that worked side by side with settlers. Old suspicions lingered, but necessity had sown a seed that neither fire nor greed could burn out. The sheriff oversaw the work with a watchful eye, no longer silent, but speaking openly about what he had seen, what he had chosen, and why it mattered. Trust grew slowly, but it grew all the same. The widow spent her nights on the porch, watching the stars. The Apache often sat near, not always speaking, but his presence filled the silence with something stronger than words. One evening he brought a carved cradle board, its wood polished smooth, its design woven with care. He placed it gently at her feet. "A promise should not be left empty," he said. Her throat tightened, and for the first time in years, her eyes filled with tears that were not from smoke or grief. She understood then that the land's gift was not only survival, but the chance to begin again. Months passed, and the railroad's threat lingered like a shadow on the horizon. Papers came, stamped and signed, declaring claims that ignored the truth of sweat and soil. Yet when officials arrived, they found more than a lone widow to face. They found a town standing firm, voices united, unwilling to yield what fire and greed had failed to take. The preacher's sermons carried through the streets, reminding them of what they had endured together. The sheriff spoke plainly to the men who came with maps, telling them the land was more than ink on parchment. And the Apache's people stood near, their quiet presence a reminder that the earth itself had its own defenders. The surveyor did return, pale and bitter, but his words carried less weight. He found no followers ready to betray their neighbors, no soldiers willing to burn again what they had helped save. His papers crumbled under the force of unity, his maps drowned by voices stronger than his greed. He left at last his shadow, fading down the long road, leaving the land to those who had chosen to protect it together. Season shifted, and the land healed. Grass rose where the fire had scorched, cattle grazed along the creek, and the well gave its water freely. The widow's porch filled with visitors now, not just neighbors but friends, bringing bread, stories, and laughter. The Apache remained, his bond with her sealed not only by promise but by the land itself. In time, a child's cry rang through the house, fragile but fierce. carrying forward the legacy she had once feared would vanish. The cradleboard lay ready, filled with both history and hope. As the years stretched on, the story of the fire and the stand at the well became part of the town's memory. People spoke of the widow who refused to yield, the Apache who stood beside her, the sheriff who chose justice, and the preacher who turned fear into unity. Children grew up hearing how the land had nearly been lost, and how it had been saved not by one, but by many who finally saw beyond division. The railroad passed to the north, its tracks laid where resistance was weaker, its whistle echoing. Far but never touching the heart of this soil, the widow, older now, still sat on her porch, the child she had dreamed of running across the yard, laughter mingling with the calls of cattle and coyotes. The Apache walked the fence line, watchful, steady as the horizon. Together they carried the weight of the past and the promise of the future. In the quiet of dusk, as the desert turned gold, the widow thought of her husband's grave, of the long years of loneliness, of the fire and the fight. She touched the earth beneath her feet, warm and solid, and whispered softly, "This land lives." It was not just hers anymore. It belonged to those who had stood with her, to the child who carried tomorrow, and to the enduring spirit of the Kirov. Soil itself. The land had tested them with fire, with greed, with the shadows of old wounds. But in the end, it gave them something greater than survival. It gave them unity, renewal, and the strength to remember that some promises are worth every fight. And as the stars rose, bright and endless, the widow knew her story had found its ending, not in loss, but in a legacy rooted deep in the ground she had refused to surrender.